Well, thank you very much, Cy, for those kind words. And I want to really thank the CAHS for the honor of not only this platform, but be the first one to address you in what's called a keynote. I'm not sure as I deserve that much billing, but I will say, though, that I'm going to speak directly to the overall objective, and I'm just reading from the program here. The overall objective of the forum is to support and extend evidence-informed discussion of commercialization of health research in Canada, and it goes on to say that more evidence is required regarding current barriers associated with the commercialization of health research. Well, I'm not going to talk primarily about current barriers. I'm going to talk about persistent, age-old barriers, because I think that's the context. It's almost the geography or the climate in which all of our specific successes and challenges take place. So I've changed the title a little bit. It takes its inspiration from a report that the Council did, a summary report of 7 studies entitled Paradox Lost, with deference to John Milton. But I want to emphasize the title that I've shown there, which is Canada's Low Innovation Equilibrium, and I've borrowed a medical metaphor to begin. I'm going to give you a diagnosis primarily, and then a prognosis. So the objectives are to really outline this framework and evidence that's going to lead us to a better understanding of this chronic problem of business innovation in Canada. So I'm going to be primarily diagnostic, and I'm going to talk from the perspective of the entire economy. Because the macro circumstances that afflict, I use that word advisedly, business innovation in Canada are really universal, and they are rooted in a common set of underlying causes, and that's what I'm going to speak to. So the relevance to any particular sector will vary in its micro detail, but I've been myself working in enough industries, and I've studied enough industries in this country. I can assure you that the conditions are universal. I've never seen an industry in Canada that isn't affected by the conditions that I'll describe. So on the policy side, I'll give you 1 or 2 slides on some very high-level principles that I think are settling out. They're not quite perhaps conventional wisdom yet, but they're on their way. But obviously the specific issues as they apply to the commercialization of health research is something that others on the program today are better positioned to speak to, and we'll have those discussions both at the platform and in the breakouts. So, Paradox Lost. This report, which, as I said, summarized 7 studies by the Council of Canadian Academies, came to 2 principal conclusions, and I think most of you know those. The Canadian academic research, and medical research in particular, is very strong and well regarded internationally, and I think it's fair to say that Canada has regularly punched above its weight. But our innovation, our business innovation, is weak by those same international standards. So that implies 2 paradoxes. The first one is easy. Why hasn't Canadian research strength yielded more business innovation? And I'll deal with that fairly quickly in 1 slide. The second one, if innovation really does enhance competitiveness, why aren't Canadian business strategies more focused on innovation? This is the fundamental mystery, and any discussion of this subject that can't account for that is really missing the primary fact. So I'm going to try and account for that. And what is important in doing so is that these paradoxes have persisted, and so their roots must be structural. Now, just how persistent? This is something everyone should memorize. Since 1916, said the Lamontagne Committee report in 1970, which was arguably the most extensive study of the science and innovation policies of any OECD nation that's ever been published. And they concluded, since 1916, the main objective of Canadian science policy has been to promote technological innovation by industry. And almost every decade since the 1920s has witnessed renewed attempts by successive governments to achieve it, but on the whole, they've all failed. Now, nothing really has changed since 1970 either. So we have essentially a century of documented experience of successive attempts by governments to, in a sense, fix this problem, and yet it has persisted. So that leads to a diagnostic question, and that is what has sustained this low innovation equilibrium, and also a prognosis question. What are the prospects that that equilibrium will finally be disrupted, and if so, how and when? So the bottom line of this slide is that the contemporary innovation policy discussion utterly lacks historical perspective. And I can't tell you the number of times I continue to read in the Globe and Mail, I continue to listen to ministerial speeches that say, oh, Canadian companies should do more R&D, Canadian companies should be more innovative. Well, come on. Where does that get you? I mean, if you've got 100 years where they haven't been, I think you have to ask yourself a question, well, what am I missing? What's wrong with this diagnosis? Now, I'm not going to spend much time on the evidence of Canada's business innovation weaknesses, but there's a couple of important points to make. In all of these comparisons, we're looking at an OECD set of countries. We're frequently comparing ourselves with the United States, partly because they're so close to us and partly because the statistics tend to be quite comparable and have been developed in great detail. What I always have to stress is that there's all kinds of exceptions to this story. There are many, many very innovative Canadian businesses. There are even sectors that are stronger than others, although I think most of them are certainly not at the top of the OECD tables. So everything I say is an average comment relative to a group whose bar of competitiveness is set quite high. Having said all that, the R&D intensity of the business sector in Canada has been actually declining since 2001, certainly as a share of GDP, and in many years, even in absolute dollar terms. We've always had low intensity of patenting. If you look at the various international innovativeness surveys that are being put out all the time, we're never terrible, but we're always 12th, 13th, 14th. I think the next bullet is a really important one. We've had few homegrown multinationals and now even fewer. And probably from an economic point of view, the most significant consequence is anemic productivity growth over the last 30 years. Again, we're comparing ourselves with the United States, which has had very high productivity growth over that period. But our output per hour across the business economy in Canada has fallen from about 92–93% of the US metric in 1984 to just above 70% today. Why is that? Well, one of our studies analyzed that gap in great detail and found that the explanatory variable wasn't capital investment or the quality of human capital. It was this mysterious ephemeral thing called multi-factor productivity growth. It's a statistical concept, but it captures better than any other statistic, in my view, the signature of what I would call disembodied innovation. It's kind of the working smarter as opposed to just getting good equipment bolted to your floor. And that has always been Canada's Achilles heel, and it suggests that at the root of the productivity growth problem lies an innovation problem. And that's a puzzle because Canada, according to the OECD standard regimen, has really taken most of the medicine that the best economists and observers in the world have been able to prescribe. You can always argue you didn't take enough, but I don't think that's really an adequate explanation. Canada has really been a model patient. Now, I want to just deal very quickly with the first paradox. Why does strong research not guarantee innovation? Well, the notion that there is a linear connection between research excellence and commercially successful products is just simply wrong. There's a few cases where it happens, but it's not the rule. I could go on for hours on this subject, but the primary contribution of academic research is the production of human capital. And it's the human capital that ultimately ends up in the economy in various places, and it's obviously therefore an extremely important input to the innovative process in the commercial side, but there's no direct connection. Unfortunately, in Canada, because the levers are a little easier to pull, our policy has focused on the supply side, pushing from the academic research into commercialization, but the real problem in Canada is on the demand side. We don't have a set of businesses that have the motivation, and I'm always speaking relatively, okay, relative to the people that we're comparing ourselves with, to take up very sophisticated research on average across the board. And the council did a couple of very detailed studies on what actually does motivate businesses to engage in innovation and what are the barriers at a macro level, and you can of course find those on the website. Now, the second paradox is the really difficult one. If innovation is good for business, and I happen to believe that it is, do most Canadian companies, and for more than a century, simply not know where their interests lie? Or is Canadian industry's innovation strategy rationally adapted to the economic incentives and the constraints that it faces? And as I said a few moments ago, most commentary, certainly the contemporary commentary, in effect implies the former, but only the latter is credible. And why do I say that? I mean, the example I always give is this. Any individual company can get its strategy wrong. Doesn't innovate enough for the market it's in, et cetera. And the market takes care of those. But to say that the whole Canadian economy, and for more than 100 years, has got it wrong, simply means you haven't understood the conditions that are motivating its behavior. That is the single most important message I want to bring to you today. So what is motivating its behavior? Well, it's a very simple story that is intuitively understood by most Canadians beyond a certain age and was a bedrock of most of the scholarship in economics and political science in this country up until the late 70s. And that was this preoccupation of the relationship between Canada and the United States. And frequently that scholarship was hand-wringing and saying we've got to be more independent, et cetera, et cetera. Walter Gordon's name was often associated with it. But the truth is that Canada has benefited enormously from what is a unique relationship geographically, culturally, and obviously economically through its adjacency to, by far, the innovation and economic dynamo of the 20th century. And so Canadian industry carved out a profitable niche in integrated US-dominated value networks. And, you know, we call ourselves a trading nation, and if you look at the export numbers in the national accounts, it looks like we are, but we aren't. Almost all the trade is intercorporate, cross-border flows within these integrated North American networks. We're not a global trading company hardly at all. Now, this is a little cartoon, but I think it really tells you all you need to know. So what I've looked at here is the North American economy divided in two, Canada at the bottom, the US at the top, and going all the way from resource extraction through processing, assembly, that would be the auto industry, large parts of our aircraft industry, production of standard pharmaceuticals, things like that, marketing, and then finally the very sophisticated end products where innovation is absolutely crucial to their production. And there's a division of labor here, which has been persistent and very logical. And the United States, because of the size of its domestic market, is a very fertile area for companies to undertake the risk of innovation because they have the market heft if they finally hit a winner to really coin it. Canada, on the other hand, has basically, I'll use the word relegated, but really chosen truncated branch plant innovation strategies, and as I said a moment ago, our limited aspirations in global trade have further reduced the pressure to be what I might call a native innovator. So, bottom line is that business is behaving rationally have found it easier and cheaper to acquire innovation in quotes from the US. Sometimes it's in the form of capital equipment, but very frequently it's in the form of business practices. I mean, we tend not to think of that as innovation, but to tell you the truth, most of the value from innovation in the commercial sector comes from business models, the organization of production, all of these softer things. It's really only 20% of the business economy that does any R&D at all. And yet the rest of the economy is still quite innovative, but just not in ways that we usually think of. And it's that other kind of innovation that's captured by that multi-factor productivity statistic I mentioned earlier. Okay, well, we're in good time. I can actually slow down a little bit. So because of this unique relationship vis-a-vis the United States, made possible by the fact, or it had the effects it's had, because the United States not only was so large and so near, but the United States was the dynamo of the world economy. There was no place where there was more innovation being done, more business productivity being generated. So in that context, Canadian business is, this kind of sums it up in a way, the second paradox. We've only been as innovative as we've needed to be, and that hasn't been that innovative. So why not? Well, if you look at corporate profit margins in Canada in aggregate, and I'm looking at the whole economy, and it varies from sector to sector over time, you see that they've either matched or actually frequently exceeded those in the United States. I'd say, well, how can that be? Well, partly it's because of what economists call the economic rents involved in raw resources. When the price of oil goes up over $100 a barrel, there's a lot of margin there. But also, I think, frankly, it's because the intensity of competition in the domestic market has not been what it is in the United States. So the profit margins are not driven down to their minimum as quickly or as thoroughly as they have been in the United States. So under these circumstances, where really is the motivation to change? Now, if you look more recently, in the last, let's say in the last 30 years or so, very strong job growth in Canada has offset the impact on per capita output of our poor productivity. GDP per capita is GDP per hours times hours worked per capita. So it's a productivity number arithmetically multiplied by a labor utilization number. And it now is the case, amazingly, that the fraction of Canada's labor force age population that's actually working is now higher than it is in the United States. So there's been an implicit trade-off in Canada between strong job growth and relatively weak productivity. And the weakness of the Canadian dollar up until 2002 actually made productivity growth a less urgent priority for business. And as Canada is such a lucky country, Australia calls itself the lucky country, but Canada, I think, is luckier. As the Canadian dollar strengthened since 2002, you know, when it was in the mid-60s and then went up to par and above, it put tremendous pressure on our highly value-added producers, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. But a commodity boom came along just in the nick of time and, of course, mitigated hugely the overall impact on the Canadian economy, though obviously with generating some significant regional strains, nowhere more so than in southern Ontario, as a result. Now, I said in the nick of time. I mean, it's not accidental that the Canadian dollar appreciated when the commodity boom came along, because the world tends to trade the Canadian dollar based on a basket of resource prices. So if the dollar goes up, it's almost surely the case that resource prices have been healthy. So the bottom line from these conditions, and particularly the first one, and that's the one that's persisted for over 100 years, is that business strategy simply isn't going to change unless the success factors change. I mean, why would it? Why, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why mess with success? I mean, there's a gazillion catchphrases that sum up this notion that when things are working, you don't try and do a major reorg, because you know that that's risky and it's likely to be very disruptive. Now, so I want to turn now in the balance of the talk to what might, we're now getting into the prognosis part, what might change this low innovation equilibrium, assuming it does have to be changed. I mean, it's produced. Let's acknowledge this country is arguably, it's certainly among the 10 most successful large societies on earth. And some would put it much higher than that. And while it's true that we haven't got quite the level of average income that the US measured by GDP per capita, I don't think too many people would trade Canadians at least would trade our model for theirs. And in fact, many of my American friends wish that they were more like us. So there are other things than just GDP per capita. The distribution obviously counts, and we've made certain trade-offs. But folks, what I can tell you is that Canadian per capita GDP growth has grown at essentially the same rate as the US for the last 80 years. So, you know, we started behind. We're still behind, but we've been growing at basically the same rate that they have, even in that narrow economic measure of GDP per capita. Now, what's going to change it? Now, this fellow, Marquez, he was the CEO of Northern Electric, which was the predecessor of Nortel, and he wrote a brilliant article in the University of Western Ontario Business Quarterly back in 1972. I'll read it for you. Among many other things, he says, it is uncertain whether any incentive plan to stimulate the growth of domestic technology and innovation or to make corporations expand aggressively into foreign markets can achieve significant success when it is applied to companies in which the drive to do these things has not already been forced to emerge because of exposure to a real stimulus from the economic environment. What we seem to need in Canada are small catastrophes. I mean, catastrophes because it's only under those circumstances that corporate behavior is likely to change, or for that matter, any behavior. So for an audience like yours, I'm saying we need the equivalent of the sort of shocks that can motivate patients to change their lifestyles, because that's really what we're talking about here. Now, are those life-changing shocks already not only on the horizon, but actually beginning to be in the foreground? And I believe they are, and I would parse this challenge into three components. The first is the opening up of new markets. We know where the growth opportunities in the world are now. The actual center of gravity of global GDP is migrating fairly rapidly eastward. And that's where opportunity lies, and it's also where, of course, competition is going to be coming from, and already is. And that has a couple of effects in Canada. On the one hand, it is improving the markets for some of our resources. On the other hand, it's bringing higher and higher knowledge-intensive goods into our own market. It's creating the kind of customer affluence that can afford more sophisticated products. But here's the thing, it's where the US and where Western Europe is really attracted. They'll be less and less concerned about Canada, more and more concerned about where these new opportunities lie. But to make your way in those markets, you've got to get out into them. So we need a much more global outlook in our business sector. And secondly, you're going to have to produce some pretty darn good products, because everybody in the world is trying to earn positions in the Chinese market, in the Indian market, and it'll be in the Vietnamese market and the Korean markets, etc., and Latin America too. Secondly, on the lower right, these new platform technologies, particularly IT, but also nano and biotech, those are probably the three most significant. These are going to be disrupting everybody's business models, and we know that IT is already doing that. And in fact, if you wanted to worry about Canada's innovative performance or their adoption of leading-edge technology, I would worry less about R&D and more about the relatively feeble investment in information and communication technologies per worker, in which there's a bigger gap relative to the US than there is in the R&D numbers. So these technologies are going to challenge Canadian businesses, even in the resource areas. And then finally, I think the most significant thing for Canada is the sustainability challenge, and whether it's the social license to continue to operate, the physical ability to get these resources to global markets through pipelines and what have you. But perhaps the thing that people don't talk about is that as the price of these resources goes up, the motivation to find substitutes increases at least as rapidly. And, you know, if you follow the literature on this sort of thing, you'll see every day there are new materials being developed that use less and less of a particular scarce raw material. I remember reading one that some Chinese people had developed a nickel alloy that was using like about 10% of the amount of nickel that exists in the standard recipe, and yet the performance of this material was just as good. So there'll be oodles of those examples, and all the more as the scarcity of raw resources increases. So it's not just the environmental issue. It's the question of substitution. So it's quite plain that you need a more innovative approach to your business strategy to cope with any of these things. And these are three trends that aren't going to go away. I mean, if anything, they're only going to intensify. So the question, though, is, will the shocks this time be sufficient to change the habits that have been formed over more than a century? And the Cassandras have been out of the box many times before. Certainly in my experience in thinking about this subject, I've wrung my own hands for 30 or 40 years, and somehow we've always managed to find a formula that sustains our prosperity without really changing our innovative habits. So it's certainly not a guarantee, but my sense is that this time the game really is different because of the scale and the inevitable persistence of those three megatrends, and the fact that they all play directly against the traditional strengths of Canadian business strategies. Okay. So, I mean, naturally, the question always will arise, what role for public policy? I got to say that public policy isn't by any means the major issue here. The major issue is what's happening in the global economy, as the Marquez quote says. But policy is significant in the following sense, that while these disruptive megatrends are going to force Canadian business to become more innovative, or else, the right policies can make that transformation faster, more efficient, and I believe of greater overall benefit for Canadians. So I'd be the last one to suggest that public policy doesn't have a role. And in fact, continuing most of the good things we've been doing is something we have to do. I mean, you have to run pretty fast just to stay in place. So I don't want to be misinterpreted as calling for a complete revolution in our policy book and to throw out everything that we've been doing. No, it's good to keep supporting academic research. It's good to keep developing incubators and trying to come up with better ways to encourage early stage financing and providing some encouragement for R&D. Maybe not in exactly the way we've been doing it, but all this is good stuff. But that's table stakes. That isn't going to win this war, as we know, because we've been doing it for 100 years and it hasn't changed anything, and things are now going to get tougher. So, as I said in the opening, I can only speak in very broad general strokes, and in the various discussions we can go into perhaps a bit more detail, but I'll give you 4 or 5 bullets. I do think that we have to be prepared to target our support more strategically on areas, and all these words matter, where we have strength, where the country has a need, and where there's really a global opportunity. So think of it in Venn diagram terms. We want to be where the 3 circles intersect, and I don't think it's an empty set. But that does imply a tough analysis and a willingness to focus, which for all kinds of political economy reasons, Canada's never been very good at. And it's partly because we're 5,000 miles wide and an inch deep. This one, I think, is really significant. We have to put a lot more emphasis on the demand pull side, because that will affect the bottom line of businesses, and they will become motivated if they have procurement opportunities, if the government can help open and sustain positions in foreign markets. Regulatory standards can be a two-edged sword. I mean, they obviously can inhibit innovation, but regulatory standards can be a very, very powerful spur, as the auto industry found with its fleet average fuel efficiency. There are many examples. But nothing is more important than competition policy at the end of the day. I mean, I can tell you, having worked in many businesses, that it was the hot breath of competition more than anything else that forced us to change our ways. I do think we have to seriously adopt this innovation ecosystem perspective. It's a bit of an abstraction, I agree, but what we're really talking about is strengthening the intermediaries and linkages between ideas and markets to promote more innovation uptake, and it's very much a nonlinear process. I will declare myself, I am not a fan of trying to, and I'm not saying that just because I'm speaking to this audience, I am not a bit of a fan of trying to force university professors and researchers to become entrepreneurs. I think it's misguided profoundly, and I don't want to be misunderstood. If you want to be an entrepreneur, if you've got a great idea, you want to form a company, that's fantastic. I mean, but that's icing on the cake. Most of that is going to be done by your graduate students anyway. Your job is to produce the best human capital possible, and the only way to do that is to be at the very leading edge of basic research when you're training your masters, PhDs, and postdocs, and what they learn at your elbow will be then applied throughout their working careers as that knowledge, which was on the leading edge when they were in their early 20s, becomes productized and part of the implementation, whether it's of health services or what have you, during their working life. And if you aren't training people at the leading edge when they're in that formative early 20s period, it won't be long before the country has even less absorber capacity than it has today. And then finally, I think because so many of these issues do cross federal and provincial boundaries, we do have to commit more to genuine collaboration. I would say that's nowhere more the case than in the general health field because of the natural division of labor between supporting research at the federal level and actually delivering the service provincially. And so this serious collaboration has got to be part of any kind of a strategy to really confront these three megatrends. And it's asking a lot, I realize it, but the truth is that the rising tide will lift all boats, and that people do have to sacrifice a little bit of their own bailiwick for the larger good. Not easy, but when you're under sufficient pressure, these things can happen. But for any of this to make any difference at all, you have to have priority from the top, and I mean from the Premier or the Prime Minister. And then I put the word sustained in italics because it is the most important. You will often get speeches made, and I think even a genuine commitment for a time on the part of a Prime Minister or a senior minister, but not sustained. So what do I say? Canada, I don't show this in front of a lot of governments, but I'm going to share it with you. Canada has always lacked a serious innovation policy. This is not a partisan comment at all. It's true of all political stripes, and they've never sustained the commitment to encourage Canadian business out of its slow innovation equilibrium. What's the evidence? Our innovation policy is essentially an R&D push policy with academic researchers as the pushers. The innovation, this tells you all you need to know. Look at who gets the innovation files. And it's not just in the federal government, it's in the provincial governments too. It's not always a junior minister, but if it's a senior minister, it's an add-on. They're doing something else. The PM science advisor, the various times that this has been tried, has never gained traction. And compare that with countries that do have a serious innovation policy, like the Koreans, the Japanese, the Finns. I could have put a lot of names there. There's been a continuous revolving door of S&T agencies and advisory bodies. The government S&T establishment, particularly at the federal level, is largely ignored as an economic asset. And the SR and ED tax credit, which is by far the largest component of Canadian innovation policy at the federal level, is just innovation policy on autopilot. Now, but this is the important point. This is more a consequence than a cause of the low innovation equilibrium. Why is that? It is because public policy responds to the needs and the demands of the constituency that is to be affected by the public policy. So if you have an economy that doesn't take innovation really seriously for its own rational market reasons that we've discussed, if you've got an economy that nevertheless is doing pretty darn well, why are you going to allocate your scarcest resources of ministerial talent, the time to engage in really serious collaborative work, the willingness to put more and more treasure into innovation support programs, notwithstanding we always talk about the economy becoming more knowledge intensive, so ideally you should be putting more money in there in relative terms. But of course it's because policy is playing into this low innovation equilibrium, and in fact it's really only a perturbation. I would say that the policy incentives across the Canadian economy as a whole in this area of innovation are only a few percentage points in terms of their power to counteract the effect of the market signals. And that's not a criticism, it's just the way it is. I mean, the market signals are overwhelmingly what determines business behavior. So, to sum this up, the business innovation problem in Canada has been around as long as the country itself, and it's been sustained by powerful market incentives that have delivered prosperity despite our low innovation equilibrium. And in fact, that explains why it is an equilibrium. It's worked. And Canadian business, and this is an important bullet, given its profitable and comfortable integration with the United States, is particularly challenged to embrace global business models because the US market is so close and easy, to keep pace with revolutionary technology because the US has been the provider of that by and large, to establish significant positions in sophisticated global value chains, which is basically a consequence of the first two, and to develop, therefore, the cluster of skills and infrastructure that enhance innovation. I mean, we've tried hard, but you've got to have more pull on the demand side. Now, what I've tried to stress in the last couple of slides is that strategic public policy can anticipate and productively amplify these new incentives that are emanating from the global market and reward those businesses that respond to them. So it's like the tiller of a sailboat. You've got the wind up there, which is coming from the global market, but policy, by moving the tiller, can have a big effect on how the vessel goes forward or not. But, and here's the fourth bullet, is crucial to understand, and it's another part of the historic perspective that we've lost. And that is that to do these things, you're going to have a more proactive microeconomic policy than has been fashionable in the Western world since the advent of what's called neoliberalism in the 1980s. I mean, that's liberalism in the traditional classic European sense of the word, call it conservatism here. It's basically the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. And that, of course, basically turned the keys over to the market. And in the course of that, the capacity, the willingness to engage in proactive policy played second fiddle, and the skills to implement proactive policy began to atrophy in the absence of demand for it. So it will require all governments in Canada to rebuild their microeconomic policy capacity, and then especially, because I don't think you can rebuild a policy capacity until you re-engage meaningfully with business to understand how they see the market, how they see the need for innovation. They're the ones that really know. And there was a time when a more activist era for economic policy in this country where the relationship between senior government officials and their various industry sectors was much closer. And understandably, given what's happened since the early 80s, that whole set of skills and relationships has degraded. Now here's the kicker, though, that reciprocally, I believe that this new competitive environment, and I always keep going back to those three megatrends, facing Canadian business should finally create a greater motivation on the part of senior business decision makers to engage more thoughtfully and collaboratively with policymakers. And that is absolutely crucial because you can't have a one-way dialogue by definition, right? And so I do believe that we're on the verge of a new relationship in which the business sector itself at its most senior levels is going to be prepared to sit down with government and say, okay, we're Canada Inc., we're facing the world, we've got all these things coming at us, we've really got to, we're ready now to try and to devote more of our strategic resources and thinking time to becoming more innovative in our various sectors, and let's sit down and decide just how public policy can help that happen. So I guess I would say that the prognosis still has to be guarded. I mean, it's questionable whether the force of these megatrends will be sufficiently felt. In other words, if the catastrophe will be apprehended, or whether it will be too gradual to really bring about the change in behavior. But on the balance of probabilities, because the Canadian industry is pretty darn rational and I think very responsible, I do believe we can be optimistic. So, Sai, that's it for now, and I think we got 10 minutes for some questions, which is exactly what I hoped.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great talk. In your summary, you're summing up here, it is clear that you've pushed on industry, and at the end, in your talk, industry pushing government to change its policy.
Yes.
What role can we play as academicians, as a society, Canadian Academy of Health Science?
That's a tough question, of course, when you get down to specifics, and I think probably that's one of the things that we should discuss in breakouts. I think that those like yourself who have had a lot of experience in taking, in this case, health research into innovative commercial products, that gives you a particular credibility. And I think that probably the advanced troops from any industry that is heavily research-based should come from those who have actually turned a lot of that research into commercial products and have been tested by the realities of the marketplace. And I think when you come and sit down, and I would stress the importance of one-on-ones, I think it's hard for large groups, and especially large industry groups, to be very effective because first they have to dilute their message quite a bit, and secondly, in the course of that dilution, it kind of lacks bite. And then there's always the problem that it sounds self-serving. But if I can speak myself as a senior person in the government at the prime ministerial level and otherwise, that I can't tell you the number of people that have come to me and lobbied me, and I found that extremely valuable. And what's great about the one-on-one is you get one-on-ones from all kinds of different perspectives, and it's up to that person to triangulate those different perspectives. And that's much more helpful than getting an already pre-homogenized vision from an organization. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That's the homogenized vision is very important for public communication to the larger population, which is, of course, important to get political leaders to act. But I can tell you that if you want to have a really productive policy dialogue, one-on-one or very small groups of people who've really had the experience would be my first advice.
Thank you. At the back.
Thank you, Peter, for a wonderful talk. Bartha Knoppers from McGill. You mentioned targeted and global. If you look at Canada's funding agencies in health research right now, you'll notice the decreasing envelopes for strategic initiatives in favor of bottoms-up open competitions. You'll notice that CFI has not yet expanded its definition of infrastructure as the Europeans have to include infrastructure science such as bioinformatics, including cost of personnel and not just buildings and machines. You'll notice that the think big philosophy that epitomized Genome Canada is gradually decreasing into little pieces. So targeted, I think we've lost our ability to sort of act in a purposeful, directed, strategic way. Global, in the Horizons 2020 competition going on in Europe, Canada's health researchers were able to compete in FP5 and FP6. We are no longer allowed to be paid partners in European competitions unless we are an SME or we are so exceptional that no one in Europe can do it, or we fall in one of the 6 Aranet themes. So if this is what's happening in health research, we are not going to meet the challenge that you just put before us.
Well, okay, that's a statement. I can't add beyond that. I wouldn't disagree, and thank you for that. Look, it's going to take a little while to turn this ship around, and it's not just in Canada but elsewhere. It's very uncomfortable, I think, for governments now to be recognizing that the neoliberal pendulum, if I could put it this way, has probably completed its arc and needs to swing back the other way, because we're still in the capture of a lot of slogans, and one is "Thou shalt not pick winners," and that's too superficial. I mean, look, there's something to that, obviously, and you don't want to pick individual companies as winners, but it simply doesn't reflect much of the success of Canada's history to take that notion off the table. I mean, look at the auto industry. We have an auto industry because Canada picked a winner. Said we want to be equal partners in the North American automobile industry. And the policy instrument, the first one was the Auto Pact, and then a lot of things followed from that. We want to have a pharmaceutical industry that actually does some R&D in this country. So we gave them a pass on patent in return for R&D. Now it hasn't worked out perhaps exactly as one would have liked, but as a consequence of that, we still have roughly $1 billion worth of largely clinical trials, I think, R&D done by the global pharma in this country. I could go on and on. I mean, probably one of the best examples, and this one actually did involve picking a company. IBM went to the federal government and said, look, if you treat us as a domestic supplier, when the government was building up, it's making big IT investments back in the 70s, we will give you global product mandates for a bunch of things and set up a great big research operation in Canada. And IBM Canada has become one of the 3 or 4 leading IBM research centers in the world. So another example would be the way the defense industry used to really nurture companies like MDA, McDonald, Detweiler Associates, CAE. These companies would not exist today were it not for the incubation provided by the Department of National Defense. So there's nothing in our history that says that identifying and choosing areas of strength that you're then going to develop purpose-built policies to support is a recipe necessarily for failure. There's lots of problems with it. There will always be rent-seeking, as the economists say. You can be captured by lobbyists and what have you. But no matter what you do, there's going to be downsides. So really it's a question of intelligent policy with discipline and learning some of the lessons of the things that haven't worked in the past. As for globalization, I just think that Canada is behind the curve still in terms of its embrace of the new global realities. And that's just another manifestation of the fact that we're sort of trying to turn a super tanker or the Queen Mary here, and it's going to take a little more time.